The room was too warm, the kind of sticky heat that clings to your skin no matter how much champagne you sip. Joyce stood near the grand piano, her red dress catching the light like a warning signal. She was laughing, that full-throated, head-tilted laugh she used to reserve for me. Her hand rested on his arm, just above the elbow, her fingers tapping rhythmically like they were sharing some private joke. The co-star, what was his name? Mike? Leaned in closer, his smirk stretching across his face like he'd just won something. I stood there, clutching my own glass, the condensation dripping onto my fingers. The ice had melted long ago, leaving the drink watery and bitter. Joyce hadn't touched hers. It sat on the table behind her, untouched, the bubbles long gone flat. I'd noticed that about her lately, the way she'd leave drinks half-finished, meals barely touched, conversations trailing off mid-sentence. She was always somewhere else, her mind orbiting a world I couldn't see. The party buzzed around me, a blur of tuxedos and cocktail dresses, but my eyes were locked on them. She tilted her head again, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, that familiar gesture that used to make my chest ache with affection. Now it just made my stomach turn. Mark or Mike said something and she laughed again, her hand sliding down his arm to his wrist. It lingered there, her fingers tracing the edge of his cufflink. My jaw tightened. I could feel the heat creeping up my neck, a mix of anger and something darker, something I didn't want to name. I took a step forward, then stopped. What was I going to do? Storm over and demand she stop? She'd just roll her eyes, call me paranoid, tell me I was imagining things. That's what she'd been doing for weeks now. You're overthinking, Gerald, she'd say, her voice dripping with that condescending tone that made me feel like a child. It's just work. You know how it is. But this didn't feel like work. This felt like betrayal, slow and deliberate, unfolding right in front of me. I could see it in the way his eyes followed her, the way her body angled toward him like a magnet. The room seemed to shrink, the air thinning until I could barely breathe. I wanted to grab her by the shoulders, shake her until she saw me again, until she remembered who I was. But instead, I just stood there, frozen, my heart sinking like a stone in water. The champagne glass in her hand caught the light, the crystal glinting like a warning. She hadn't taken a single sip all night, not a single sip. And that smirk on his face, it wasn't just amusement. It was triumph. He knew something I didn't, something that made his eyes gleam with a predatory satisfaction. My fingers tightened around my glass, the stem threatening to snap. I turned away before I could do something I'd regret, the sound of her laughter echoing in my ears like a taunt. The room felt colder now, the heat replaced by a chill that seeped into my bones. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just a party. This was the beginning of the end. The living room was dim, the only light coming from the muted TV casting flickering shadows across the walls. I sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the family photo above the fireplace. Joyce, our son, and me, all smiling like we didn't have a care in the world. The photo felt like a relic from another life, a life I wasn't sure I even recognized anymore. The house was too quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes your thoughts louder than they should be. My son, Ethan, walked in, his footsteps hesitant, like he was carrying something heavy. He was still in his school hoodie, the sleeves frayed at the edges, and his face looked pale under the dim light. He didn't sit down. He just stood there, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, his eyes darting to the photo and then back to me. "Dad," he started, his voice cracking like he hadn't used it in days. "I need to tell you something." I looked up, my chest tightening. His tone wasn't the usual teenage grumble or the half-hearted sarcasm he'd perfected over the years. This was different. This was raw, like he'd been holding on to something too big for him to carry alone. "What's going on, Ethan?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but it came out rougher than I meant it to. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Last week, I went to the studio after school. I thought I'd surprise Mom, you know? Bring her some coffee or something." He paused, his voice trembling now. But when I got there, she wasn't alone. The air in the room thickened, like the walls were closing in. I could feel my pulse in my throat, a steady, sickening throb. "What do you mean, she wasn't alone?" Ethan's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't let them fall. She was with him. That guy. Her co-star. They were, I don't know, Dad. It wasn't just talking. They were laughing and she was touching his arm like she does with you. And then they went into her dressing room together. I didn't realize I'd been holding my breath until I heard the sharp exhale escape my lips. My hands clenched the edge of the couch, the fabric digging into my palms. Did you see anything else? He shook his head, but the look on his face told me everything I needed to know. No, I didn't stay. I just left. I didn't know what to do, Dad. I didn't want to believe it. The room felt colder now, the silence heavier. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to punch a hole in the wall. But instead, I just sat there, staring at the family photo, at Joyce's smiling face, frozen in time. How could she? How could she do this to us? To him? Ethan sank into the chair across from me, his shoulders hunched like he was trying to disappear. I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't want to tell you, but I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. I reached out, my hand shaking, and placed it on his knee. You did the right thing, Ethan. This isn't your fault. None of this is your fault. He nodded, but he wouldn't look at me. His voice was barely a whisper when he said, I don't want to lose her, Dad. I don't want to lose our family. Neither do I thought, but the words stuck in my throat. Because deep down, I knew. The family we had, the one in that photo, the one we built together, was already gone. And no matter what I did, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't put it back together. Not now. Not after this. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows like it was trying to get in. I stared at the family photo one last time, at Joyce's smiling face, and felt something inside me harden. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The kitchen light buzzed faintly overhead, casting a harsh glare on the untouched plates of pasta between us. Joyce sat across from me, her fork resting neatly beside her plate, her red nails tapping the table in a rhythm that felt like it was mocking me. Her wedding ring, the one I'd saved for months to buy, caught the light, but she hadn't touched it in weeks. Not to adjust it, not to twist it nervously, nothing. It just sat there, cold and still, like a relic of a life she'd already moved on from. You've been distant, I started, my voice steady but brittle. And I'm not imagining things, Joyce. I saw you at the party. The way you were with him. Her eyes flicked up to mine, and for a second, I thought I saw something. A crack in her composure. But then it was gone, replaced by that icy stare she'd perfected over the years. Gerald, she said, her tone dripping with condescension. You're being ridiculous. You're always so dramatic. It was a work event. I was being professional. Professional. The word hung in the air like a bad smell. I wanted to laugh, to scream, to hurl my plate against the wall. Instead, I leaned forward, my hands gripping the edge of the table until my knuckles turned white. Professional? Is that what you call it? Your hand on his arm, laughing like you were sharing some private joke? Do you think I'm stupid? She exhaled sharply, a sound that was half sigh, half exasperation. You're being paranoid. You've always been like this, Gerald. You see shadows where there's nothing. Maybe you should talk to someone about that. Her voice was calm, measured, but there was a sharp edge to it, like she was carving away at me piece by piece. I felt the heat rising in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. Our son saw you, I said, my voice low. At the studio. He told me. For the first time, her mask slipped. Just a fraction, but enough. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and her fingers stopped tapping. But then she recovered, leaning back in her chair like she was the one in control. Oh, so now you're using our son to spy on me? That's low, even for you. This isn't about spying. I snapped, slamming my hand on the table. The silverware rattled, and her untouched wine sloshed in the glass. This is about you lying to me, about you sneaking around with him. What the hell is going on, Joyce? She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I'm not doing this, she said, her voice cold and final. I'm not going to sit here and let you accuse me of things that aren't happening. If you can't trust me, then that's your problem, not mine. I stared at her, my throat tight, my chest aching like I'd been punched. You're not even going to deny it? I asked, my voice breaking. You're just going to act like I'm the crazy one? She paused at the doorway, her silhouette framed by the dim light of the hallway. I don't have to deny anything, she said quietly. Because there's nothing to deny. Get some help, Gerald. You're losing it. And with that, she was gone, leaving me alone at the table with the cold remnants of a dinner that neither of us had touched. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second a reminder of the silence between us. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at her empty chair, the weight of her words pressing down on me like a stone. She hadn't denied it. Not really. And that was the worst part. The hum of the computer fan was the only sound in the room. A low, steady whir that seemed to echo the dull ache in my chest. The editing room felt smaller than usual, the walls closing in as I sat there, staring at the flickering screen. Old family videos played in a loop, Joyce laughing as she chased our son, Michael, through the backyard, her hair catching the sunlight like spun gold. Back when her smile wasn't a weapon, when it wasn't something she wielded to disarm me. Back when it was real. I reached for the coffee mug on my desk, forgetting it was empty. The ceramic was cold against my palm. The last dregs dried into a bitter stain at the bottom. I didn't remember when I'd last refilled it. Time had blurred into a haze of sleepless nights and endless reels of footage. My hand trembled as I set the mug down, the clink of it against the wood too loud in the quiet. The footage switched to a birthday party, Michael's 6th, I think. Joyce was cutting the cake, her hands steady as she sliced through the frosting. She looked up at the camera, her eyes crinkling at the corners as she smiled. "Stop filming, Jerry," she'd said, her voice warm and teasing. "You're missing the fun." I'd laughed then, the sound tinny and distant through the speakers now. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed that version of her. Or maybe I just missed the version of me that believed in her. I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking under my weight. My eyes drifted to the wedding album on the shelf, its once glossy cover now dull with dust. I hadn't opened it in years. The last time had been our anniversary, back when we still pretended to celebrate. Joyce had made dinner, some fancy recipe she'd found online, and we'd sat at the table, making small talk like strangers. She'd worn her wedding ring that night, I remembered. It had caught the light from the candles, a cruel reminder of promises she'd already broken. The screen flickered again, this time showing a clip from a vacation we'd taken to the coast. Joyce was standing on the beach, her hair whipping in the wind as she turned to face me. "Come on, Jerry," she'd shouted, her voice barely audible over the crashing waves. "The water's perfect." I'd stayed on the shore, holding the camera, content to watch her, always watching her. My throat tightened as I rewound the clip, watching it again and again. Each time, her laughter sounded more hollow, her smile more forced. Had I been blind, or had she just gotten better at hiding? The truth was, I didn't know anymore. All I knew was that the woman in those videos felt like a stranger now, someone I'd once loved but could no longer recognize. I wiped at my face with the back of my hand, my fingers coming away damp. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee and old paper, a scent that clung to everything in this house. It was suffocating, but I didn't have the energy to open a window. Instead, I reached for the keyboard, pausing the video on a single frame. Joyce, mid-laugh, her eyes bright and unguarded. For a moment, I let myself believe it was real. Then I closed the file, the screen going dark. The silence was unbearable. I reached for the wedding album, brushing off the dust with a shaky hand. The first page was a photo of us at the altar, Joyce's veil catching the light as she smiled up at me. I thought we were invincible then, that nothing could touch us. I'd been such a fool. I slammed the album shut, the sound echoing in the empty room. My reflection stared back at me from the darkened screen, my face pale and drawn. I didn't recognize that man either. The editing room was my sanctuary, my war room. The faint hum of the computer fan filled the silence, and the glow of the monitor cast long shadows across the cluttered desk. My camera equipment sat neatly arranged, lenses gleaming under the dim light. It had always been my tool for capturing truth, for telling stories. Now it was my weapon. I opened the calendar on my phone, scrolling through the dates. Joyce had been working late more often, sometimes not coming home until well after midnight. Her excuses were flimsy: studio reshoots, script revisions, networking events. I believed her at first, but now I saw the pattern. The lies were written in red ink, bold and undeniable. I marked the dates she'd mentioned, cross-referencing them with her co-star's social media posts. He was always there, always in the background, smirking like he knew something I didn't. I pulled out a USB drive from the drawer, small and unassuming. It was the kind of thing you'd overlook, forget about, perfect for storing evidence. I plugged it into my computer, the soft click echoing in the quiet room. My hands trembled slightly as I began to transfer files. Old family videos, photos of Joyce and I, all the moments that now felt tainted. I needed to preserve them, to remind myself of what was real before it all slipped away. The camera bag was heavy as I slung it over my shoulder. I adjusted the settings, making sure the battery was full, the memory card empty. This wasn't just a job anymore. It was a mission. I wasn't doing this to hurt her, not really. I needed the truth, something solid to hold on to. The thought of confronting her without proof made my stomach churn. She'd twist it, make me out to be the paranoid husband, the jealous fool. No, I had to be smarter than that. The first stakeout was the hardest. I parked a block away from the studio, the engine off, the windows cracked just enough to let in the cool night air. The faint scent of rain lingered, though the sky was clear. I checked the time, 9:47 p.m. Joyce had said she'd be home by 10. I knew better. The camera rested on my lap, the lens cap off. Ready. My heart pounded, not from excitement, but from dread. Part of me hoped I was wrong, that she'd walk out alone, tired but faithful. But the other part, the part that had been gnawing at me for weeks, knew better. At 10:23 p.m., the studio doors swung open. Joyce stepped out, her laughter carrying through the quiet street. She wasn't alone. His arm was around her waist, his head bent low as he whispered something in her ear. My grip tightened on the camera. I lifted it, zooming in, the lens capturing every detail. The way her hand rested on his chest, the way she leaned into him, the way she smiled at him like she used to smile at me. The shutter clicked softly, freezing the moment in time. I felt sick, my stomach churning, but I kept shooting. Frame after frame, I documented their betrayal, their intimacy. The camera was my shield, my distance. It kept me from screaming, from storming out of the car and demanding answers. Instead, I focused on the task, my hands steady even as my heart shattered. When they finally disappeared into his car, I set the camera down, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I pulled out the USB drive, inserting it into the laptop and transferring the files. The images loaded slowly, each one a knife to the chest. I labeled the folder carefully, evidence, and tucked the drive into my pocket. It felt heavy, like a stone, like a secret I couldn't carry alone. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty street. The rain finally came, soft at first, then heavier, drumming against the roof of the car. Felt fitting, the world crying for me when I couldn't. I started the engine, the hum barely audible over the storm. As I drove home, the USB drive rested heavily in my pocket, a small, unassuming thing that held the power to destroy everything. But it wasn't about destruction. Not really. It was about truth. And the truth, no matter how painful, was the only thing that could set me free. The cafe's neon sign flickered in the rain, casting a sickly green glow over the wet pavement. I sat in my car, the engine off, the windows fogging up with each shaky breath I took. The camera on the passenger seat felt heavier than it ever had before, not just in weight but in what it represented. This wasn't just a tool of my trade anymore. It was a weapon, and I was about to use it. I'd followed her here after another one of her late-night shoots. She'd left the house in that red dress again, the one she'd worn to the party where all this started. I told myself I wouldn't do this, that I wasn't the kind of man who'd stoop to spying. But here I was, parked across the street like some cheap private eye in a bad noir film. I hated myself for it, but I hated her more. The cafe was small, tucked away in a part of town I didn't recognize. The kind of place you go to when you don't want to be seen. Through the rain-streaked windshield, I watched as Joyce walked in, her heels clicking on the wet pavement. She didn't even look around, didn't hesitate. She knew exactly where she was going. A few minutes later, he showed up, her co-star, the one with the smug grin and the perfectly tousled hair. He scanned the street quickly before ducking inside, his collar turned up against the rain. My hands shook as I adjusted the camera, zooming in on the cafe window. The condensation made it hard to see clearly, but I could make out their silhouettes. They sat close, too close, their heads tilted toward each other like conspirators. I hit record, the red light blinking like a heartbeat. The timestamp on the screen burned into my vision. 10:47 p.m. The rain fell harder, drumming on the roof of the car. I could feel my pulse in my temples, a steady, angry throb. I wanted to storm in there, to throw the camera down and scream at them both. But I didn't. I stayed put, my finger hovering over the zoom button, capturing every detail, every touch, every laugh, every moment that confirmed what I already knew but didn't want to believe. When they left, they didn't walk out together. He left first, glancing over his shoulder like a guilty man. Joyce stayed behind, sipping her coffee like nothing was wrong, like she hadn't just shattered everything we'd built. I kept the camera rolling until she finally stood, smoothing her dress and heading for the door. She paused under the neon sign, her face illuminated in that green light. For a second, she looked almost ghostly, like a memory fading away. I rewound the footage on the drive home, watching it over and over. The grainy quality made it feel surreal, like I was watching someone else's life. But it was mine. This was my marriage, my reality. The timestamp mocked me, a cold, unfeeling reminder of the exact moment my world fell apart. By the time I got home, the house was dark. Joyce was already in bed, pretending to be asleep. I sat at my desk, the camera still in my hands, and stared at the screen. The footage was undeniable. There was no way to spin it, no way to explain it away. This was it, the proof I'd been both dreading and desperate for. I didn't sleep that night. I sat there, replaying the footage, each frame etching itself deeper into my mind. The cafe's neon sign, their laughter, the way she touched his arm. It was all there, captured in perfect, damning detail. I felt numb, like I'd been hollowed out. But beneath the numbness, there was a spark of something else. Anger, yes, but also resolve. I had the truth now, and I wasn't going to let her twist it, not anymore. The room was a blur of sequins and champagne flutes, the kind of event where people laughed just a little too loudly and clinked glasses like they were trying to prove something. I stood in the corner, my hand resting on the projector remote, the weight of it like a stone in my pocket. Joyce was across the room, radiant in her emerald green dress, laughing at something her co-star, no, him, had just said. Her hand brushed his arm, lingered for a moment too long, and I felt that familiar knot tighten in my chest. The projector screen loomed behind her, blank and waiting. I'd spent weeks planning this moment, stitching together the footage like some kind of deranged quilt. There were clips of them at the cafe, their heads bent close together, her hand resting on his thigh. There were timestamps, dates, all the little details that made it undeniable. I wasn't doing this to hurt her. Not really. I was doing it because I needed everyone to see what she'd done, to make it real in a way it hadn't been when it was just me, alone in the editing room watching my marriage unravel frame by frame. I pressed the remote. The room dimmed, the chatter fading into confused murmurs as the first image flickered onto the screen. Joyce's laugh died mid-sentence. She turned, her face pale under the harsh light of the projector. The footage was grainy but unmistakable. There they were, her and him, in that secluded corner booth, her lips brushing his ear, his hand sliding up her back. The room seemed to hold its breath. "What is this?" someone whispered, but no one answered. The gasps came next, sharp and sudden, like a wave crashing. Joyce's hands, so steady a moment ago, began to tremble. She took a step back, her heel catching on the edge of the carpet, and I saw the exact moment her mask slipped. Her eyes met mine, wide and panicked, and I felt a sick kind of satisfaction twist in my gut. "Gerald," she said, her voice trembling, but I didn't respond. Couldn't. The footage kept playing, each scene more damning than the last. The crowd shifted, uncomfortable, some looking away, others staring openly, their faces a mix of shock and pity. Joyce's co-star, him, tried to slip out, but someone blocked his path, and he froze, his face flushed with humiliation. Joyce took another step toward me, her hands outstretched like she was trying to stop a runaway train. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "Please, turn it off." I couldn't. The footage rolled on, the sound of their laughter, their whispers, filling the room. The projector light caught the tears in her eyes, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered the nights I'd spent lying awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every lie, every excuse, every time she'd looked me in the eye and told me I was imagining things. The screen went black. The room was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like it's pressing down on you. Joyce stood frozen, her hand still outstretched, her face a mask of raw, unfiltered shame. I turned off the projector, slipped the remote back into my pocket, and walked out. The night air was cold, sharp against my skin, and I stood there for a long time, breathing it in. Behind me, I could hear the muffled voices, the whispers, the sound of Joyce's sobs. I didn't look back. Couldn't. Not yet. The divorce papers sat on the kitchen table like a dead weight, their crisp edges gleaming under the harsh overhead light. Joyce stood across from me, her face a mess of smeared makeup and trembling lips. The house felt hollow, the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums until you can't think straight. The fridge hummed faintly in the background, a sound I hadn't noticed in years, but now it was all I could hear. "Gerald, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. It was a mistake. I was confused. I was lonely. I cut her off, my voice steady but cold. "Don't. Just don't." My hand hovered over the papers, the pen lying beside them like a weapon waiting to be picked up. Her tears didn't move me anymore. They used to. God, they used to. But now they just felt like another performance, another act in the endless play she'd been starring in. She reached for my hand, her fingers cold and trembling. I pulled away before she could touch me. "You don't get to do that," I said, my voice low. "You don't get to cry and expect me to fix it. Not this time." Her face crumpled, and she sank into one of the kitchen chairs, her red dress pooling around her like spilled wine. The dress she'd worn to the party where I'd exposed her. The dress that now felt like a costume she couldn't take off. "I'll change," she said, her voice desperate. "I'll do anything. I'll quit the show. I'll never see him again. I'll..." "Stop," I snapped, the word sharp enough to make her flinch. "It's too late for that. You made your choices, Joyce, and now I'm making mine." She stared at me, her eyes wide and pleading, but I couldn't look at her anymore. I focused on the papers instead, the black ink of my name already signed at the bottom. All that was left was hers. The emptiness of the house pressed in around us, the walls echoing with memories that now felt like lies. The family photos on the fridge, the half-finished crossword puzzle on the counter, the coffee mug she'd left in the sink. It all felt like props in a play that had long since ended. "I still love you," she said, her voice barely audible. I let out a bitter laugh, the sound harsh in the quiet room. "You don't love me. You love the idea of me, the stability, the safety, the life we built. But love? No, you don't get to say that word anymore." She flinched again, her hands clutching at the edge of the table like she was afraid she might fall. "What about our son?" she asked, her voice breaking. "What about him?" I felt a pang in my chest at the mention of our boy, but I pushed it down. "He's old enough to understand," I said, my voice softer now. "And he deserves better than this. Better than us pretending everything's fine when it's not." She didn't say anything after that. She just sat there, her shoulders shaking silently as the tears streamed down her face. I picked up the pen and slid the papers toward her. "Sign them," I said, my voice firm. "It's over." For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, with a trembling hand, she reached for the pen. Her signature was messy, the ink smudged where her tears had fallen. When she was done, she pushed the papers back toward me and stood, her movements slow and unsteady. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. She turned and walked out of the kitchen, her heels clicking softly against the tile. The sound faded as she moved through the house, and then there was silence again. Just me, the papers, and the empty home that would never feel the same. I sat there for a long time, staring at her signature on the page. The finality of it hit me like a punch to the gut. But I didn't cry. Couldn't. Instead, I folded the papers neatly and slipped them into the envelope, sealing it with a firm press of my hand. It was done. The house felt colder now, the air heavy with the weight of everything we'd lost. But for the first time in months, I felt a strange sense of relief. It was over. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something better. The editing room was my sanctuary now. The dim light from the old desk lamp cast long shadows across the cluttered desk, where stacks of hard drives and notebooks sat like relics of a life I no longer recognized. The faint hum of the computer filled the silence, a steady rhythm that matched the ache in my chest. I'd spent weeks sifting through footage, not just the damning clips of Joyce and her co-star, but the home videos, the candid moments, the stupid little things I'd filmed over the years without thinking. Our son's first steps, family vacations, lazy Sunday mornings. All of it felt like a lie now, but I couldn't stop watching. The framed photo of my son sat on the corner of the desk, tilted slightly to the left. He'd been my anchor through all of this, the one person who hadn't betrayed me. I'd catch myself staring at it during late nights, the weight of his quiet confession still heavy in my mind. He'd been brave to tell me the truth, even when it hurt. I owed it to him to make something worthwhile out of this mess. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my eyes. The footage on the screen paused on a shot of Joyce laughing, her head thrown back, her hand resting on her co-star's arm. It was the same laugh I'd fallen in love with, the same one that used to light up the room. Now it just made me sick. I rewound the clip, watching it again and again, searching for the moment I should have seen it coming. But there was no single moment, no smoking gun. Just 1,000 little betrayals I'd been too blind or too trusting to notice. I started cutting. The sound of the scissors slicing through the film was cathartic, like I was carving out the rot that had infected my life. I spliced together clips of Joyce's lies, her excuses, her cold dismissal when I confronted her. Interspersed them with the home videos, the happy moments that now felt like a cruel joke. The documentary was taking shape, raw and unfiltered. It wasn't just about Joyce anymore. It was about me, about the man I'd been, the man I was becoming, and the man I refused to let myself be. The phone buzzed on the desk, breaking my concentration. It was Joyce, again. She'd been calling non-stop since the party, leaving voicemails that ranged from tearful apologies to angry demands. I didn't bother listening to them anymore. Her voice, once so familiar, now felt like a stranger's. I muted the phone and tossed it aside, turning back to the screen. The documentary was starting to feel like something real, something honest. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a storyteller, someone with control over the narrative. Maybe that was all I'd ever wanted, to tell the truth, even if it hurt, even if it destroyed everything. I worked through the night, the glow of the screen the only light in the room. By dawn, I had a rough cut. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. The sunset outside my window painted the room in hues of amber and deep orange, the kind of light that makes everything feel softer, even the edges of pain. I sat there, staring at the framed photo of my son on the desk, his smile frozen in time from a family vacation years ago. Beside it sat the finished documentary, its title bold and unapologetic, Broken Frames. It wasn't just a film about betrayal, it was a record of my unraveling and, eventually, my reconstruction. Forgiveness. That's the word people kept throwing at me after the fallout. Friends, well-meaning but clueless, would say things like, "You'll feel better if you just forgive her," as if forgiveness were some magical eraser that could wipe away the scars. But here's the thing. Forgiveness isn't for the person who wronged you. It's for you. It's about letting go of the weight that's been crushing your chest, the kind of weight that makes it hard to breathe, hard to move forward. I didn't forgive Joyce because she deserved it. I forgave her because I deserved peace. The documentary was my way of making sense of it all. At first, I thought it would be a weapon, something to expose her completely, to make her feel the shame I'd carried for so long. But as I edited the footage, something shifted. The more I watched, the more I saw not just her betrayal, but my own complicity. I had ignored the signs, buried my suspicions, and let her gaslight me into doubting my own instincts. The film became less about her and more about me, about the man who had let himself become a shadow in his own life. When I screened it for a small group of friends and colleagues, the room was silent except for the hum of the projector. I watched their faces as the truth unfolded on screen. Joyce's secret meetings, her cold dismissals, the way she had manipulated me with such precision. But the hardest part to watch was myself. My denial, my desperation, my slow unraveling. When the credits rolled, no one knew what to say. One of my oldest friends finally broke the silence. Jesus, Gerald. I had no idea. I didn't need their pity or their outrage. I just needed them to see, to understand, and maybe, in some small way, to learn from my mistakes. Joyce tried to reach out after the screening. She left voicemails, sent emails, even showed up at my editing room once, her face streaked with tears. "You've humiliated me enough," she said, her voice trembling. "Can't we just move on?" I didn't respond, not because I hated her, but because I had nothing left to say. The silence between us wasn't punishment, it was liberation. Now, as I sit here in the quiet glow of the sunset, I feel a strange sense of calm. The anger that used to simmer beneath the surface has cooled into something more manageable, like embers rather than flames. I've stopped checking my phone for her messages. I've stopped rewinding the past, trying to find the moment when everything went wrong. Instead, I've started to focus on what's ahead. My son has been my anchor through all of this. He's the one who reminded me that I'm still his dad, still the guy who taught him how to ride a bike and edit his first video. "You're better off without her," he told me one night, his voice quiet but firm. And he was right. Joyce may have been my wife, but she wasn't my life. Not anymore. The documentary has started to gain some traction online. People are calling it raw, honest, heartbreaking. I've gotten messages from strangers, men and women who've been through similar betrayals, thanking me for telling a story they couldn't. One woman wrote, "Your film made me realize I deserve better. That's the part that matters. Not the views or the accolades, but the idea that maybe, just maybe, my pain can help someone else avoid theirs." Forgiveness wasn't about letting Joyce off the hook. It was about reclaiming my own narrative, about saying, "This is my story, and I won't let you define it anymore." The quiet smile on my face as I look at the finished film isn't about triumph over her. It's about triumph over the version of myself who thought he wasn't enough. The sun dips lower, casting long shadows across the room. I close the laptop, the hum of the projector still echoing in my mind. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I can breathe. Not because the pain is gone, but because I've finally stopped letting it control me. And that, I realize, is the truest form of forgiveness.